Nobody wants to talk about the fact that these things, these demonized characteristics in men, are exactly what women find sexually and emotionally appealing. The security and strength of men attracts women. And so what has the APA done? They've reframed the typical connection between men and women that ultimately winds up as mutual reliance, and they've demonized the whole thing in order to build an even greater gulf between men and women. And they've been wildly successful, largely thanks to the obsequiousness of men.
Okay. This year, the American Psychological Association published a document 11 years in the making. It was produced by the totally not sinisterly named Division 51. This document is not a treatise on how to fool a gullible public into believing that aliens don't exist, all while exploiting extraterrestrial technology for use against humans in a multi-globalist interstellar new galactic order. No, it is nothing nefarious like that. This document was produced by, I hope, are well-meaning professionals who believe the best way to treat men and boys in crisis is to tell them that they are bad, ignore the ways in which they're discriminated against, and to recruit them to become feminists. So here to present the very, very, very convincing argument that this might not be the best thing for men's mental health, I will present to you. Author of 3 books on how to hate women by being compassionate toward men and boys, Tom Golden. Former mad pseudoscientistic blogger, occasional bad language user, and current grand dragon of the patriarchy, Paul Elam. Sean T. Smith, a terrible YouTube troll who gives advice to young men on how to determine that all women are toxic in the service of destroying healthy heterosexual relationships. Dr. Sean T. Smith. Rob Tiller, who was rightly, correctly, and justly fired from his position at Relationships Australia for his disgusting slandering of women as even remotely capable of perpetrating domestic violence on partners and their own children. So welcome to Rob Tiller. And finally, Tim Goldich, a veteran misogynist who has for decades repeated the falsehood that society feels more love and compassion and a greater impulse of protection for women than for men. What a loony. So, men, have at it. We're going to start with Tom. I mean, these are all people who are knowledgeable about men's mental health, but we're going to start from the right and work our way over. And I just want you to sort of inform the audience exactly what that Division 51 guidance really consists of and what you object to in it.
Huh, that's a big one. Hello? Can you hear me? You gotta eat the mic. Well, I have a long history with Division 51. They kicked me out. You know, I was part of their mailing list, and they threw me out. You know why they threw me out? They said I was hostile, which means that I disagreed with a lot that they were talking about. And the reason I was upset with them was the guy before me who got kicked out. Do you know why he got kicked out? Because he said too many times that men were also victims of domestic violence. And I'm not making this up. They literally kicked him out for the reason that he mentioned male victims of domestic violence too many times. So that's the kind of group we're talking about here. I mean, these people, first off, they have a very, very strong sense that everything is socialized and that men could certainly change and become more like women if only they wanted to. In fact, one of the guys said, one of the higher ranking guys in Division 51 said, you know, if only men could be more like women, the world would be a better place. So they are completely devoid of an idea that men and women are wonderfully different. They just don't get it as far as that goes. And I think that you can see in the guidelines they put out, that's exactly what you get from them.
Hey you! Yes, you! Watching this video. Did you miss out on going to the International Conference on Men's Issues? Or did you go and now you missed the fun times you had at this amazing event? Experience the magic of ICMI 2019 again, or for the very first time, with Honey Badger Radio's ICMI disc set. The disc set brings ICMI presentations together in one convenient package, as well as disc set exclusive Badger bonus content. Enjoy behind-the-scenes Badger interviews with free speech and men's issues luminaries, like Sargon, Janice Fiamengo, and Count Dankula, as well as a never-before-seen Badger cartoon. Also available is sparkling ICMI merch, such as our professionally designed program book, sticker sets, badges, and more. Go to feedthebadger.com and claim a piece of men's rights history for yourself.
Anyway, let's see what Paul says.
Hi, everybody. I guess, oh, eat the mic, sorry. My experience with this far predates Division 51. I mean, I think that Division 51 is a tumor that has grown from something much more deep-seated. In 1993, when I read The Myth of Male Power, I was working as a program director in a substance abuse facility. And if you can imagine, in that population, there's a great deal of family violence. At that time, we evaluated every woman who entered that facility for treatment on whether or not she had been the victim of domestic violence. We determined with the men whether or not they had perpetrated domestic violence. And I did this for a long time without ever even thinking about it. I was part of the problem. Then I read The Myth of Male Power, and I came to work shortly thereafter saying, hey, wait a minute, how come we're only evaluating women for whether or not they're victims and only evaluating men for whether or not they're perpetrators? Might we lose some abuse in that? In particular, might we not see abuse that's happening to children if we're not willing to even examine whether or not their mothers are violent? And guess what the reaction was? We hate your guts. You hate women. What are you talking about? This is terrible. Don't ever bring that up here again. And several people sought to get me fired because, true to my tradition in life, I don't know when to shut up. And yes, I am. And so I kept talking about it and kept talking about it, and sure enough, the hostility for this was so great that people sought to destroy my career. That's how intensely people feel about not seeing women with agency, because that's what it boils down to, is that we can't see women as responsible, capable, autonomous human beings. In other words, it's misogyny. And that's what got me started as an activist, and it's what makes me very pleased to be a part of this panel today.
Well, similarly, I'm one of the bad good guys, as determined by, sorry, that is, you do have to kiss it. So I was working for Relationships Australia as a counselor. I've been a couples counselor for 12 years, and kind of classically trained in, I guess, feminist counseling, I guess, style or orientation. And what I was seeing with the couples I was working with was that a lot of times the conflict would escalate based on a tit-for-tat style, where, you know, the female partner might say something provocative, the male partner responds, and then it turns into a slinging match. And so there's this model called the Duluth model, and it's become dogma within the kind of feminist approach to domestic violence or couples therapy, where men are perpetrators, women are victims. And and it just wasn't panning out in what I was seeing in terms of the couples that I was working with. It was bad behavior on both sides. And I think it was 2016, a personal friend of mine who's, I think, giving a talk tomorrow from Sydney, Bettina Arndt, wrote an article in the Australian newspaper, which is the newspaper. It's like the New York Times in Australia, where she spent 6 months putting all of the international statistics on and research on domestic violence together. And basically what the consensus was it takes two to tango. In most cases, there are a small percentage of cases where you're dealing with sociopathic men who are batterers and wife beaters. I've met a very small handful of those kind of characters in my 12-year career. So I circulate Bettina's article amongst my colleagues, and it ends up on the CEO's desk, who would call it, she calls herself a feminist. She's a single woman in her 60s running Relationships Australia. And so she tells me that I'm a danger to women. I've been working with female clients, couples clients, male clients. I've been running workshops, psychoeducation, anger management, how to get along better, my whole career, and I got chopped for basically saying, hey, I'm not finding this gendered model to work in couples counseling. And once I got trained in how to call out a woman's bad behavior in the context of couples therapy, my clients, couples clients, started generating different outcomes quicker. Thanks, guys.
You guys don't know how to toe the line and stay out of trouble. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and I work independently, which is why I have not gotten in trouble yet. I work for my clients. I don't work for an agency or the government or university. And when these guidelines came out earlier this year, the APA guidelines for working with boys and men, I heard all the commotion, and I started looking into them. So I read the guidelines closely. Oh, okay. Okay. Oh, it doesn't taste real good, but you guys had the eggs for breakfast. So I started looking into the guidelines, and more than that, I started looking into the references and digging into what went into these guidelines, because the APA will put out guidelines periodically, actually fairly consistently, and usually they're about what you would expect. They're kind of arcane and boring and clinical. For example, I came across one recently, how to deal with acute pancreatitis. Not a lot of social justice warrior posturing in that particular set of guidelines, but every once in a while the APA will take an ideological bent, and the guidelines for working with boys and men was one of those examples where the references behind these guidelines are purely ideological. Not all of them. There are about 425 references, and some of them are on issues like retirement or substance abuse. They're all over the board, and I would say most of them are fairly even-handed. But there are two words that appear throughout the guidelines. They're privilege and oppression. And those two words are so important in these guidelines that they appear in the first paragraph of the introduction, the very first paragraph of the text. I think in the third sentence they introduce the idea that men are inherently, men and boys, inherently privileged, and that they cause oppression. And this idea resurfaces throughout the guidelines, in almost every guideline. Even when they do manage to give men a little bit of credit for anything, they still go back to the idea that men are privileged oppressors, in particular white heterosexual straight men. Right? Heterosexual and straight, that's synonymous. White heterosexual men. And so this theme resurfaces, and where this shows up in the references is in purely ideological pieces. Like, for example, there was a piece by Peggy McIntosh written in 1988, and it's very famous in social justice circles, and she talks about her personal observations of privilege. And it's not entirely a bad essay, She talks about essentially don't take your luck for granted. And there are some good points to be made in that essay, but it's a 30-year-old essay. And in the third paragraph, she admits that this is an editorial. She says, this is nothing empirical about this. This is just part of my observation in life. The APA took that 30-year-old editorial, and that is the sole foundation of the concept of privilege in these set of guidelines that is such a foundational privilege. So I could go on all day, but that gives you a sense of my problem with these guidelines and how it translates into essentially shaming men and boys, in particular boys. I have a daughter, I don't have a son, but I would not want my son to grow up with this message that you are inherently broken. And I'm not particularly thrilled about my daughter growing up with the idea that all the boys around her are inherently broken. So I'll leave it there for now.
I guess I have my own microphone to eat, so that's good. Yes, yes, that's male. It's male privilege. Well, first of all, I just want to say that, you know, I try and stay a bit detached emotionally from gender issues so I don't go crazy. You know, I've been at this for over 30 years, you know, and I just don't want to lose my mind over all this stuff. But I have to say, with this APA thing, that really got to me. It is such a prestigious organization. It's so authoritative. And when they start in on the feminist rhetoric and the male bashing and the toxic masculinity bandwagon, it's pretty frightening. My attitude toward it is, of course, that it's appalling. I'm like a gender theoretician, so what I do is I try and work out why, what's going on here. So as I figure it, there's been this story, the story that men have the power and women are the victims, and it's like as old as the hills. And it's sort of congruent with instinct, chivalry, and it's congruent with eros, with it's erotic. It's like it's sort of an erotic story. It's the story of hot, hunky, empowered heroes coming to the rescue of sweet, weak, innocent damsels in distress. So it has this deep psychic resonance. Historically, I think the story was romanticized. And I think it competed with a more intuitive understanding that men and women each had their own particular version of the human condition, and each had their own spheres of influence, and they each sort of suffered their part and enjoyed their part, you know. But what we have in more recent decades is that the story's become politicized. And part of the politicizing of that story is that if women are the victims, then men, the ones with the power, must be the victimizers. And so what I see basically is a sort of being puppets to this instinct and this story. And it's gotten really dangerous. It's getting really dangerous. It has been for some time, but I mean, you know, it just there's this meme going around. I guess I don't know if it's true or not, but apparently, if you put a frog in a pot of water and turn up the heat slowly enough, the frog will boil before it reacts. And that's what I see happening in maledom. I just see the heat being turned up so slowly, and the new normal just keeps cranking up. And I don't know when there will ever be sort of male rebellion on this. I just don't see it happening still. It's very worrisome. I don't know. Things have to get worse before they can get better. But I mean, there's really nothing to say about the APA guidelines. It's appalling. I mean, there's nothing. It's prejudice, you know. Gender bigotry is gender bigotry, even when it's directed at males, you know. So, should we bring it back to who? I don't know.
You're the one with all the privilege.
Here, I'm here coming to the rescue. of you damsels in distress. Okay, so are you guys well acquainted, any of you, with Halleck's Conformity to Masculine Norms Inventory, which I know was another important document that was used in that? Please, Tom, can you tell me about some of the items in that inventory and how they decided which ones to put in there and which ones to keep out?
Ugh. That's some of the sickest research I've ever seen. You know, I did a paper criticizing that particular study, and it's on Men Are Good. But basically, I don't know where to start to tell you how silly that thing was. I mean, the guy, he came up with these new ideas about what masculinity is. So I wrote to him. I said, well, you know, how did you get these ideas? And he wrote back, he said, well, I checked the literature. And I wrote him back, I said, well, can you send me the literature that you got it from? So he sends me back this book. He says, well, you can see this book. So I looked for the book. The book was out of print. So I guess he was figuring that I wasn't going to, you know, check it down. But I found the out-of-print book. I found it. And one of the things that he said was that one of the characteristics of men was they were playboys. And this book was where he got the idea that men were playboys. And so I read the book, and guess what I found in the book? Yes, indeed, 1% of men said they were playboys. But that was one out of... there was 4 other categories that were really positive.
I think that the other categories were nurturer, breadwinner, and
yes.
a faithful partner.
Yes, they were all very positive. But he picked this one, somehow, he picked this one about, you know, it didn't make any sense. And I could go on and on about this particular research and how it's faulty. But what the man was doing, in my opinion, was he was taking what, what's the theorist's name? The trans woman.
Raywin Connell?
Yes, Raywin Connell had come up with this masculinity ideas, and it seems to me that the guy that wrote this research was just plugging in Connell's ideas out of no place, because the other ones that he put in, you know, men were violent. That was a masculine norm. Men were playboys. Men disdained homosexuality. And what was the other one, Karen?
Oh, winning, you know, winning
okay.
as characterized by agreement with the statement, in general, I will do anything to win, which is not typical of the expectations we place on men. We expect men to not cheat. We expect men to, yeah.
The other one was power over women.
Yeah, dominance
and power. A masculine norm
is
is having power over women. It's just crazy stuff. Is that enough?
Yeah. I mean, like, I do want to point out, I'm going to step in here and I'm going to essentially say, you know, we have, in terms of the winning thing, one of the reasons why he included winning, how many men in this room feel pressure from society to be successful? Oh, that's a lot of hands. How many men feel like they should win at any cost, no matter what, do anything they have to win? How many men think that that would be socially approved of? Oh, well, none. There you go, none. One. Unbelievable. Get out. We have, as an example of this, an entire arena of culture called sports. And sports was essentially built by men. I mean, the entire history of sport goes back, you know, thousands of years, and it is a culture where it's not acceptable to do whatever it takes to win. There are rules. There are things that you're not allowed to do. There is an expectation that you honor your opponent if you're in competition, all of those things, right? And so how is it that we have winning in this inventory but not being successful? And the reason is that because women sometimes also feel pressure to be successful, and therefore it's not a masculine norm, right? That is how he chose these criteria. So no wonder Playboy didn't make it into the feminine norms inventory, because no woman thinks society wants her to be a slut.
Yeah, that's the other thing. This researcher did an opposite one for women, where it was conformity to female norms, and all of them are sweet and nice. Thinness, they want to be thin, they want to be sweet. It's like, oh my gosh. And so in Division 51, Karen, I pointed out that the one list for men looked very negative, and the one list for women looked very positive. And you know what? Every person there said, oh, that's crazy. That's crazy. They're all the same. It's like, it's a crazy place, Division 51, let me tell you.
I'd like to add something else to this discussion that doesn't get mentioned very often when we talk about male and female characteristics. And you know, obviously what they've been discussing here is that typical male characteristics are demonized, that success becomes winning, strength becomes dominance. All these things get reframed in a negative light to show men negatively. But what they also won't talk about is these characteristics in men: strength, success, winning, and not at any cost, but just winning. What happens to men in the sexual landscape of their lives if they don't have these characteristics?
Incel.
Women abandon them. Nobody wants to talk about the fact that these things, these demonized characteristics in men, are exactly what women find sexually and emotionally appealing. The security and strength of men attracts women. And so what has the APA done? They've reframed the typical connection between men and women that ultimately winds up as mutual reliance, and they've demonized the whole thing in order to build an even greater gulf between men and women. And they've been wildly successful, largely thanks to the obsequiousness of men.
I was flying up from Texas to the conference, and I was reading an article in Psychology Today that actually Paul basically was saying exactly that. This lady therapist who wrote the article was seeing an exodus of women from their relationships who had these emotionally flexible, these emotionally sensitive, domestically available characteristics. You know, guys who were the sensitive new age guy. Their wives, according to this therapist, were, checking out in droves and complaining about exactly what you were saying. They were looking for men with some traditional masculine qualities. This was her theory as to why they were leaving, because there's a kind of stand-up quality that women do respond to. My girlfriend, she would call herself a feminist, but she would say she likes a masculine guy. So, and I think what you're saying is what I've observed in my own couples work, where and I guess what I was saying before about how couples counselors are trained or how couples therapists are trained, it's a lot of it's influenced by the feminist rhetoric, and it's not based in science. It's not based in empirical research like what John Gottman's doing or people like David Snarsh, who I've done a lot of training with. It's based on these ideas that men can become basically hairy women. And that's the ideal. And I guess, like I was saying before, I've done a lot of intensive training with David Snarsh, who understands the feminine dark side, how to access it and call it out in a way where ladies respond, where they don't feel like I'm spotlighting them or saying you're a bad person. It's like, no, I'm not attacking your character. I'm focusing on your behavior. And I think that's what works therapeutically with anybody is, well, there's some behaviors here. They're creating conflict dynamics in your relationship. Let's look at the behaviors. But what these philosophies or ideologies is probably more accurate are saying is, well, men are fundamentally flawed creatures who need to be upgraded. And we've got the solution. We know how to do it. We shame them into submission, basically. And yeah, no thanks.
I will echo what Rob just said about women not particularly enjoying men who are effeminate. And in my practice, when I work with couples, I don't bring up politics. I don't push any agenda. Unlike the APA, I try to focus on the client. But twice, a particular topic has come up in my practice, and politics does come up if the client brings it up. But with two separate women on two separate occasions, they have both been very liberal, very left-leaning, and said that they don't like dating liberal men. And I asked them why. Both of these women both said they're just not attractive. And I take it for what it's worth, but if you correlate more traditionally masculine traits like competitiveness and so forth with conservative men, that tends to be, at least in my experience, what women find attractive. But I want to add to what I think the cost of this is and why these guidelines even matter. Part of it is that, yes, we're training men to be something that women find unattractive, but in the larger sense, why do these matter? Well, the APA has no influence over my practice, really. As an independent practitioner, they just don't influence me, so these guidelines don't influence people like me very much. But the problem with these guidelines is that the APA is the largest accrediting body for psychology training programs. And that means that if you are a student who wants to become a psychologist and you want to, say, for example, go into forensics, you want to work in a prison or something like that, the chances of you getting an internship and a postdoctorate if you have not gone through an APA accredited program are low. It's not impossible, but it's a lot tougher. And so there is tremendous pressure from students to make sure that their training programs are APA accredited, which means that there is tremendous pressure on these training organizations to toe the line. That means that if a school wants to maintain its accreditation and remain competitive with other schools, they need to toe the line. They need to put in place these ideologically driven guidelines that are coming down from the APA. That means that schools are being compelled to train their students to push an agenda and to push that agenda on their clients. And the reason I say that is that earlier I talked about the definition of privilege in the APA guidelines for boys and men. I didn't talk about the definition of oppression. Where they got their definition of oppression in these guidelines was from two sources. One was a social justice counseling textbook, not a particularly practical one. The other one was from a book called, forgive me, I need to get my phone so I get the title exactly right. It was called Feminist Perspectives in Therapy, Empowering Diverse Women. This is where they got the definition of oppression that is a fundamental concept that appears again and again and again in these guidelines, and it is a book that proudly excludes the interests of men. And so in both of these references that they built the definition of oppression is a strong call for clinicians to behave as activists in the clinic. And so bringing my argument to a conclusion here, the APA is compelling schools who want to remain accredited to compel their students to become activists in the clinic. And I find that absolutely repugnant.
Is there, yeah, well, one more thing from Tim, and then we might not have time for questions, but you go ahead and say one last thing, and then we'll.
So what was that? Characters of men that have power over women? Is that it?
They
yes.
want power over women.
Oh, I see. That's interesting. So let's see a show of hands. All the men who have power over women. This is not a representative sample here.
Last I checked, the phrase was "happy wife, happy life." So.
Well, I'll just say quickly that one of the final frontier, perhaps, in gender studying gender understanding is understanding female power. You got to understand that female senators and CEOs are wielding a high-end form of male power. Female power is a different thing, applied through different channels. It's beauty power, sexual power, it's moral authority, it's motherhood, it's the greater powers to elicit empathy and inflict shame. There's all these different female powers, and until we understand female power, we cannot understand female accountability. So that just leaves all fault is male. So we need to understand woman as equal partner in the human system, equally responsible for outcomes. And it's a long haul, but I think there are ways of doing that. And as Paul mentioned there, one of our ace in the hole, as it were, is that the very legitimate accusation of those who are naysayers of female power that it's misogynistic, it's sexist and misogynistic. And but yes, as the theoretician in me, that's where I go with that. And so this whole thing, it's an abuse of female power. The greater power to elicit empathy and bring caring, concern, compassion to themselves is the power that raises only female concerns to the level of major societal concerns. It's a female abuse of the power to shame, the would-be hero in the male. Once you get a grasp of what female power is, you can call women on it and hold women accountable for it and the damage that it's doing.
Okay, excellent. That's a really good note to end on. We have time for a couple of questions, so line up at the mic and all right, go ahead.
Thank you. The Duluth model of domestic violence, in my opinion, encapsulates all of the means by which women abuse men. Is that a fair assessment? Can you reflect on that?
Is it just projection? That's what he wants to know.
She stole the words right out of my mouth. The Duluth model is projection. One of the things that we don't really get to talk about very much in this whole picture of violence in relationships is relational aggression. And this is the kind of aggression most common to women in relationship. It starts very early in life. This has been measured 3 years old. Women demonstrate relational aggression and men demonstrate physical aggression early on. We talk a lot about physical aggression, and now the feminist response to men's supposed physical aggression is relational aggression. It's persecution. It's class warfare. And it is a projection of their own hostility toward men. If you look at that wheel with a discerning eye, you can see it. Anybody else on this?
And I guess what I've observed is, women are particularly apt or capable in terms of weaponizing dirt. So you live with somebody long enough, you get their dirt. And I think there's a lot of provocation that comes from that female side. That is, it's sophisticated and it's nuanced and it's subtle and it's the long game in a lot of cases, and there's a kind of psychic erosion that I've seen that happens in the male partners, and so that's completely left out of the conversation. It's like, well, what does that relational aggression actually look like? What does it look like in behavior? It's sophisticated, it's subtle, it's nuanced, and it's aggressive, and it's mean.
I'd just add one thing, and that is that the best definition I've ever heard of relational aggression is that it's bullying without violence.
All right, next question.
Hello. So first of all, thank you all for your public criticism against the APA guidelines. So I filed a Title IX complaint against, an institution for endorsing the APA guidelines. and it was assigned to the Boston Regional Office of the Department of Education, which has never favorably resolved a Title IX complaint from a male complainant before, ever, throughout like its entire history. So it was dismissed. But one particular logic that they used in dismissing the letter, and now I'm reading like from the dismissal letter coming from this like partisan attorney, is the APA explains that the professional practice guidelines are intended to inform psychologists and are not requirements that APA members must follow. The APA reiterates that the guidelines do not take precedent over a psychologist's informed professional judgment. So OCR, the Office for Civil Rights, basically told me because these guidelines are not really guidelines, so they're not really going to take any action. So I'm reading like directly from the federal like letter that I received. So what is your response to this line of reasoning?
It's bullshit.
Okay,
Maybe a bit more detail, but thank you.
someone might want to give a more nuanced reason as to why that's bullshit. I don't know, Sean. Do you want to just speak to that briefly?
Yes, the beauty of the APA guidelines, if you are a feminist ideologue, is that you can impose these guidelines on training programs, but the guidelines themselves, every set of APA guidelines says what you just said, that they are not a mandate, that they are aspirational. So if you aspire to maintain your accreditation, you will fall in line. That's the implicit accusation there. But the beauty of it is they can play both sides of this. They can get it in the classroom, they can get it into the clinic, but there's plausible deniability when someone like yourself says, hey, something's not right here.
Plausible deniability is actually another form of female abuse. Okay, one more question.
Hi, Paul again here. Paul Elam, I like what you said about the things we're not talking about. That's just the tip of the iceberg. You wonder how we got into this mess, why there are APA guidelines. We have not talked about the complicity of men in the women's movement and in feminism. Men have always held power in society. How is it that we got into this mess? It's because feminism has always worked through powerful, high-ranking men to achieve their agenda. And why would they choose powerful, high-ranking men? Because these are the men to whom the feminist movement is no personal threat, because they already have their pick of women, and it doesn't matter who they are, how cruel they are, how brutal, how masculine, how dominant. They are the top of the heap. They're going to get their choice of women no matter what. So that is the type of man that the feminist movement has always worked through. And Senator Ted Kennedy was a wonderful example of this. There are men in high places in the APA, in corporations, and indeed in the White House from time to time. So that's one thing we need to be talking about, Paul. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you for that.
One more question, I think. Maybe two.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a counselor in Cleveland, Ohio, and I almost also did not get my license because I was in trouble in my internship because I brought up that the Duluth model was garbage and we were using it. I brought in a stack of research like that. I did get my license though, so it's all good. It strikes me that part of the reason the conversation with women gets shut down so quickly about these issues is that there's a terrible fear that you give an inch and it'll all go back to how it always used to be. There's a belief that men want things to be awful for everyone. So I'm curious to know if you have any advice, not just maybe for female clients, but women in general, on how to have that conversation. The onus for this should not fall upon men, but it does, to say, I don't want that. How can you communicate that to women?
Talk. Do what you did. I mean, it's really simple. It's just not easy. There's a lot of pressure to remain silent. There's a lot of rewards, especially for women, to align with the feminist view of the world. But continue to do what you're doing, and it's right to point out, this isn't, as the last person who commented talked about, just the richest men. The average guy out there is a big part of this problem, because he doesn't want to risk the disapproval of women. He will sit there and say any kind of bullshit. And this is, look, I've been told that the men's movement is just feminism for women. That is dead wrong. The onus is on men. Men have to change for things to change for men. And the first thing that they have to do is be willing to risk the disapproval and rejection of women in order to stand by their values. And thank you for standing by yours.
Okay, we're at the end. If you can ask your question really quickly, and one of you can answer it really quickly, then we'll do one more since the lunch is coming up.
So obviously, with all intersectional groups, a lack of foresight is a big issue. But what do you think the end game is for the intersectional feminists who are like, if they're not even attracted to feminized men, what do you think their goal is with all of this?
I hope they're gone by attrition if they don't breed.
That's a good point.
To me, an absolutely key quote that just sums up feminism for me is Natalie Angers said, "The world of men is the world." Okay, so if you think deeply enough about that, you get what it's all about. It's an enormous envy of the masculine. If the world of men has everything, and the world of women has nothing, you know, what kind of mindset is that? So feminism has always been about punishing and having envy toward men, and basically, you see, most of them, they love the masculine, as long as it's not being displayed by a man. You see, so I mean, the end game really is to take the place of men. If you feminize men enough and masculinize women enough, you can.
It's like the invasion of the body snatchers.
There you go.
Yeah, I think we got to close. That was actually, I think he's spot on.
Thank you.
We got to. We will reconvene at 2:00. It is lunchtime, so everybody go have some lunch. There will be nothing going on in the Rosemont room at 2:00 because our keynote speaker, the great, powerful, and deeply evil Tommy Sotomayor, will be giving his address at that time. So it'll be standing room only. Don't be late.